Hey, tonight we're venturing into the true Wild West. Not the Hollywood portrayal with its heroic cowboys and dramatic showdowns, but the harsh, perilous reality where survival was never assured. You might think you're tough enough to endure it, but believe me, there's a reason it earned the name Wild. If you're enjoying these tales, I'd truly appreciate a quick like or even a subscribe. It makes more difference than you realize. I'm always curious where everyone is tuning in from, so leave a comment with your location and what time it is there. I love seeing our small global community connect through these stories. Now dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for a soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. We're going to uncover why surviving even a single day on the untamed American frontier was no guarantee. Congratulations, you've just woken up in the American Wild West of the 1870s. The good news, you're about to witness a legendary chapter of history firsthand. The bad news, your odds of survival have just dropped dramatically. The first challenge hits before you even open your eyes. The smell, not the earthy, pleasant scent of nature you might expect, but something far stronger. The stench of unwashed bodies, animal droppings, and possibly raw sewage hanging heavy in the air. You see, bathing wasn't exactly a priority in the Wild West. Most settlers considered a proper wash a monthly luxury, and that's being generous. Some went entire winters without a real bath. Water was precious out here, and using it to clean yourself seemed wasteful when it was needed for drinking and cooking. As you haul yourself out of bed, likely a straw-filled mattress crawling with bed bugs, you notice every muscle aches. Life on the 1870s frontier meant constant physical labor from dawn till dusk. No weekends off, no vacations, and certainly no ergonomic considerations. Whether farmer, miner, or ranch hand, your body was your primary tool, used until it failed. You might think your modern work is hard, but frontier labor was an entirely different level. Backbreaking work leaving even the strongest permanently hunched and arthritic by 30. Imagine 14 hours plowing fields, hauling water, chopping wood, or working deep underground in a mine. No wonder the average lifespan was about 35 years. Standing on the dusty floor, you feel the chill. In winter, your cabin might be 20 degrees below freezing. If you had a fireplace, you'd likely let it die overnight to save fuel. Forget central heating or thermal underwear in this era. In summer, get ready to sweat through every piece of clothing. There was no escaping the elements in the Wild West. Speaking of clothing, comfort was minimal. Men typically owned maybe two sets, rough canvas or denim pants and cotton shirts that chafed. Women wore multiple layers regardless of whether chemises, corsets, petticoats, long dresses dragging in dirt. Everything was scratchy, ill-fitting, and seldom washed. Those fancy outfits seen in Western movies, pure fiction for the average person. Your stomach growls, reminding you it's breakfast time. Hope you like beans, biscuits, and coffee, possibly for every meal. The Wild West diet was monotonous and nutritionally lacking. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal luxuries. Meat, when available, was often salted or smoked because refrigeration didn't exist. Scurvy, vitamin C deficiency, was common, causing bleeding gums and tooth loss, despite being preventable with modern knowledge. You might think the coffee would at least be decent. Cowboys always seem to have a pot brewing in movies, but what you get barely resembles coffee. Usually boiled to death, bitter beyond belief, sometimes mixed with crushed eggshells or salt to reduce bitterness. Still, the caffeine helps face the day, so you drink without complaint. Before stepping outside, check your shoes for scorpions or snakes that may have sheltered overnight. Frontier folks often shook out their boots each morning, born from painful experience. One wrong move could mean a venomous bite miles from medical help. Stepping outside your cabin, the vastness of the frontier is breathtaking but unforgiving. Extreme weather appears suddenly, blizzards, tornadoes, flash floods, droughts, all deadly if unprepared. A clear sky now could change in minutes. If you settled in a town, civilization offers some protection but also new dangers. Towns were hotbeds of disease. Without proper sewage or germ knowledge, illnesses spread fast. Cholera, typhoid, smallpox, diphtheria, tuberculosis. An outbreak could decimate half a town in weeks. Approaching a town, you notice it lacks the organized layout you might expect. Many grew haphazardly, buildings placed wherever convenient, often without planning. Streets aren't paved, Dirt tracks turn into mud when it rains and dust when dry. The smell hits again, horse manure everywhere since horses were main transport. No street cleaners or sanitation departments. In some areas, waste could be knee-deep. Flies swarm, showing why disease spreads so easily. Walking down the main street, you pass the saloon, likely one of the busiest spots. Contrary to Hollywood, saloons weren't glamorous. Most were crude, one-room affairs with plank bars and basic furniture. Liquor wasn't fine whiskey, but raw alcohol sometimes mixed with tobacco juice, pepper, turpentine, or even gunpowder. One drink could blind you if unlucky. Saloons also highlight frontier violence. These places frequently hosted deadly confrontations, not formal duels, but drunken arguments escalating in an armed society. Romanticized gunfights of movies were rare. Most violence was impulsive, messy, and over trivial matters. Everyone carried weapons, but not solely for protection. Guns were tools for hunting, defense against wildlife, and signaling. Bears, wolves, cougars, venomous snakes made going unarmed foolish, especially when traveling. Surprisingly, many towns had strict gun control. Dodge City, Kansas, and Tombstone, Arizona, required visitors to surrender firearms. The OK Corral gunfight began because the Clanton gang refused Tombstone's ordinance. Quick-draw duels at high noon. Mostly Hollywood invention. Real frontier violence was sudden, chaotic, and lacking honor. Passing the local doctor's office, medical care would shock you. Most doctors had little formal training. Surgeries used only whiskey or morphine as anesthesia. Sterilization was rare. An infected cut could mean amputation or death. Common treatments, bloodletting, mercury, arsenic, often doing more harm. Childbirth mortality could reach 1 in 4 in remote areas. Dentistry meant extraction without anesthesia. Injuries or illness often relied on luck for survival. Even minor wounds could become life-threatening. Broken bones might never heal properly, leaving chronic pain. Only the strong survive had literal meaning in the Wild West. Your stomach growls again, time for lunch. The local eatery was likely someone's home serving meals for a fee. Food offered no more variety than breakfast. Meat was tough and sometimes spoiled. Vegetables, if present, overcooked to mush. Food safety didn't exist. Dysentery and poisoning were common. While eating, you overhear talk of Indian attacks, outlaw gangs, or dangers of traveling alone. Native American violence was less frequent than portrayed. Settlers and the military were often the aggressors. The frontier remained a place of constant conflict. The systematic displacement of indigenous peoples caused tensions that sometimes erupted into violence on both sides. As for outlaws, they posed a real threat, especially in remote regions. Law enforcement was sparse, with a single sheriff often responsible for thousands of square miles. In many areas, justice was delivered through vigilante action rather than formal legal procedures. Lynch mobs were frequent, and the concept of innocent until proven guilty often didn't apply. If accused of horse theft or cattle rustling, you might find yourself hanging from a tree before sunset, regardless of actual guilt or innocence. After lunch, you decide to visit the local general store to stock up on supplies. The prices shock you. Basic necessities cost far more on the frontier than back east due to the difficulty and expense of transportation. A simple can of peaches could cost the equivalent of $20 today. Many settlers spent most of their income on essentials, leaving little for comfort or luxury. The store also highlights the isolation of frontier life. Mail delivery was infrequent and unreliable. Newspapers might be weeks or months old. Information traveled slowly, and some settlers went years without news from family back east. Many never saw their relatives again after moving west. This isolation took a psychological toll, contributing to high rates of depression, alcoholism, and suicide among frontier populations. As afternoon progresses, dark clouds gather on the horizon. Frontier weather wasn't just uncomfortable, it could be deadly. Without modern forecasting, storms arrived suddenly. Blizzards could strand travelers, causing freezing deaths. Tornadoes could obliterate entire communities with no emergency services to help. Flash floods washed away wagon trains. Droughts ruined crops, causing starvation. If you were lucky to have a proper home, it offered minimal protection. Most dwellings were hastily constructed from whatever materials were at hand. Sod houses on the plains, log cabins in forests, simple wooden structures in towns. None were particularly effective against extreme weather. Winter inside could drop below freezing. Summer heat was unbearable, especially in attics or upper floors where many slept. As the storm nears, you head back to your cabin. On the way, you pass men heading to work at the local mine. Mining was one of the deadliest frontier professions. Cave-ins, toxic gas, explosions from mishandled blasting powder, and machinery accidents claimed countless lives. Miners also suffered long-term health problems, black lung from coal dust, mercury poisoning from gold processing. Even outside mining, few frontier jobs were safe. Farming involved dangerous equipment with no safety features. Ranching meant working with unpredictable animals weighing hundreds of pounds. Logging had one of the highest fatality rates of any profession. Whatever your work, the risk of serious injury or death was far higher than in the modern world. You reach your cabin just as rain begins. The roof leaks in several places, so you set buckets to catch water. This is a chance to refill drinking water. Clean water was scarce and precious. Many settlers drank from sources used for washing and watering livestock, leading to waterborne illnesses that could quickly become fatal. Sitting in your leaky cabin, listening to rain, you reflect on how different reality was from the romanticized Wild West. There were no heroes or villains, only people struggling to survive harsh conditions. That anyone survived is a testament to human resilience and determination. Night comes early with no electricity. Candles and oil lamps give minimal light, and you handle them carefully. Fire was a constant danger. A single spark could destroy everything, with no fire department to call. Many towns burned to the ground at least once in their history. Exhausted from one day in the Wild West, you prepare for bed. Your muscles ache, your stomach protests unfamiliar food, and your mind is overwhelmed by the vigilance needed to stay alive. As you drift to sleep, you wonder if you'll survive tomorrow or become another statistic in the story of the American frontier. The wind howls outside, a haunting reminder of human vulnerability against the untamed wilderness. Tomorrow, if you live to see it, will bring these challenges again, along with new ones yet unknown. Survival in the Wild West was never guaranteed. It was earned day by day, hour by hour, through hardships most modern people can scarcely imagine. Morning light filters through the cracks in your cabin walls, waking you from restless sleep. Your body aches from the hard mattress, but there's no time to linger. The Wild West waits for no one. Rising, you recall yesterday's harsh introduction and wonder what new challenges await. Deciding to leave town today to travel across the frontier, you face a vastly different experience than today's travel. Whether heading to another settlement, joining a wagon train west, or exploring, conditions are harsh. By now, the Transcontinental Railroad connects east and west coasts. Good news. Bad news. Unless wealthy or traveling between major cities, you probably can't afford it. Most settlers traveled by horse, wagon, or on foot. Owning a horse was a privilege. Horses were expensive with high maintenance costs. A good horse might cost months of wages, plus saddles, bridles, feed, and veterinary care. Veterinary care often meant shooting the animal if injured or ill. Riding wasn't comfortable. Saddles were functional, not designed for comfort. Hours in the saddle caused blisters and aching muscles. If the horse spooked at a snake or sudden sound, which happened frequently, you could be thrown, potentially breaking bones miles from help. Without a horse, you traveled by wagon. Forget romantic pioneer images. Wagons were brutally uncomfortable, with no suspension beyond the slight give of wooden wheels. Every rock, rut, and hole jolted you. Constant jarring caused wagon sickness like seasickness, leaving travelers nauseous. Roads, if existing, were dirt tracks carved by earlier travelers. After rain, they became muddy quagmires. When dry, dust thick enough to choke and blind. Wagons frequently broke, wheels cracked, axles snapped far from settlements. If journeying to California or Oregon, you join a wagon train on the Oregon Trail. This 2,000-mile journey was one of the 19th century's deadliest. Of roughly 400,000 attempting it between the 1,840 to 1,860, about 1 in 10 didn't survive. The Oregon Trail earned the nickname, the nation's longest graveyard. Some historians estimate 10-15 deaths per mile, a grave every 350 feet across 2,000 miles. The trail was lined with makeshift crosses and stones, many nameless, as families buried loved ones and pressed on. Disease was the #1 killer. Cholera, spread through contaminated water, was particularly deadly. This illness caused severe diarrhea and vomiting, draining the body rapidly. A person could be healthy at breakfast and dead by dinner. Wagon trains sometimes lost dozens in a single outbreak. Other diseases, dysentery, typhoid, mountain fever, claimed countless lives. Children were especially vulnerable, with many families losing multiple kids. Medical care was rudimentary, often consisting of folk remedies that sometimes worsened conditions. River crossings posed another deadly challenge. Wagons weren't designed to float, yet pioneers crossed numerous rivers. Some had ferries or fords, many required floating the wagon like a makeshift boat. Wagons capsized, drowning people and livestock and destroying supplies. The Platte, Columbia, and Snake rivers claimed hundreds of lives. Contrary to popular belief, attacks by Native Americans were rare. Most tribes assisted migrants, offering supplies, guidance, and river crossing help. Most violent deaths came from accidents, being crushed by wagon wheels, drowning, or being kicked by draft animals. Firearm accidents were common, as many travelers were inexperienced, though carried weapons for hunting and protection. The psychological toll of the journey was immense. Families buried children, parents, and spouses along the way, then had to continue traveling immediately. There was no time for extended grief on the trail. Each day's delay meant a smaller chance of crossing the mountains before winter snows made the passes impassable. The constant stress, sorrow, and physical hardship led many travelers to mental breakdowns. Suicide was not uncommon among those on the trail. If you somehow survived the journey to California or Oregon, your challenges were far from over. Many arrived having spent all their money and resources on the trip itself. Families often reached their destination destitute, malnourished, and ill, only to discover that the promised land had its own harsh realities. Suppose you decided not to travel so far, perhaps heading to a nearby town or settlement instead. Even short journeys in the Wild West posed serious dangers. Travelers might encounter outlaws who viewed lone riders or small groups as easy targets. While stagecoach robberies were exaggerated in later fiction, they occurred often enough to be a real concern. The natural environment posed continual threats. Flash floods could wash out trails or trap unwary travelers. Desert heat in summer could cause fatal dehydration or heat stroke. Winter blizzards regularly trapped travelers, sometimes leading to freezing deaths or desperate measures, like the infamous Donner Party, where survivors resorted to cannibalism to survive. Navigation itself was difficult before detailed maps. Travelers relied on vague directions, shifting landmarks, or guides who were sometimes unreliable. Getting lost in the wilderness could be a death sentence, especially if supplies ran low. As you travel, you notice another aspect of frontier life rarely depicted in movies: the incredible diversity of people. The Wild West wasn't populated solely by white cowboys and settlers. It was a meeting point of cultures from around the world. Chinese immigrants worked as railroad builders, miners, and merchants. Mexican families had lived in the Southwest long before it became U.S. territory. Black cowboys made up as much as 25% of the workforce on some ranches. European immigrants from Germany, Ireland, Italy, and Scandinavia brought their own cultures and traditions. And of course, dozens of distinct Native American nations had called these lands home for thousands of years before newcomers arrived. This diversity, however, did not mean equality or harmony. Racial violence was a constant feature of frontier life. Chinese railroad workers faced brutal discrimination and were often assigned the most dangerous jobs for lower pay than white workers. Mexican landowners frequently had property seized through legal manipulation or outright theft after the Mexican-American War. Black Americans moving west to escape Southern discrimination often found frontier racism equally entrenched, albeit different in form, despite their essential contributions to ranching, mining, and community building. They were frequently excluded from economic opportunities and social acceptance. For Native Americans, white settlement expansion was catastrophic. The indigenous population, once perhaps 15 million, was reduced to fewer than 300,000 by 1900. Disease, warfare, forced relocation, and deliberate destruction of food sources, especially buffalo, decimated numerous tribes. U.S. government policies systematically pushed Native Americans from traditional lands onto reservations, often with poor soil and scarce resources. Treaties were frequently broken when valuable resources were found on reservation lands. Native children were taken to boarding schools meant to erase cultural identity, following the philosophy, "Kill the Indian, save the man." The romanticized cowboy versus Indian narratives of later films misrepresented the complex interactions between settlers and indigenous peoples. Many nations initially tried to accommodate newcomers and adapt, while violence typically erupted after repeated treaty violations, land encroachment, or deliberate provocations. Continuing your journey, you consider another group misrepresented in Hollywood: frontier women. Far from helpless damsels or schoolmoms in Western movies, women performed grueling physical labor while navigating restrictive social norms. On homesteads and farms, women handled domestic duties like cooking, cleaning, childcare, and making clothes, but also worked fields, tended livestock, and defended the home when needed. Their days began before dawn and ended long after dark, with few breaks. A frontier woman might plow fields in the morning, deliver a neighbor's baby at midday, fend off predators in the afternoon, and still prepare meals and care for her children. Many became widows young and managed farms or businesses alone. Despite vital contributions, women had few legal rights. In most territories and states, they could not vote, own property independently if married, or retain custody of children in divorce. Domestic violence was treated as a private matter, with little legal recourse. Unmarried women had limited options. Teaching was one of the few respectable jobs, but female teachers earned less than men and were often expected to resign upon marriage. Some found economic independence through running boarding houses, nursing, or millinery and dressmaking businesses. Then there were the soiled doves, prostitutes in frontier brothels and saloons. Later myths romanticized them, but reality was grim. Many entered the profession due to economic desperation after widowhood or abandonment. Physical abuse, addiction, and venereal disease were common hazards. Even women who earned money were often socially ostracized. Some women found greater freedom than back east. The shortage of women in Western territories gave them more marriage options and sometimes better treatment as communities competed to attract female residents. A few territories, like Wyoming and Utah, granted women voting rights decades before the 19th Amendment, acknowledging their essential contributions to frontier development. As the day continues, you may wonder about law enforcement in this supposedly lawless land. Reality was complex and varied. Major towns had some organized law enforcement, but vast rural areas had minimal official protection. County sheriffs, elected officials, maintained order across enormous territories. A single sheriff could cover thousands of square miles, making regular patrols impossible. Deputizing ordinary citizens for emergencies was common, forming posses to pursue criminals or respond to violence. Town marshals managed law enforcement within town limits, sometimes with a few deputies in larger settlements. These jobs were dangerous and poorly paid, attracting a mix of dedicated public servants and those drawn to the power of a badge. Famous lawmen like Wyatt Earp moved between legitimate law enforcement and questionable enterprises. Federal marshals had jurisdiction across territories and states, but were few. They focused on major crimes like counterfeiting, mail robbery, or multi-jurisdictional offenses. The legendary lone U.S. Marshal bringing law to lawless towns was largely fictional. In many remote areas, justice came from informal community action rather than official processes. Vigilante groups formed to address perceived threats when law enforcement was absent or ineffective. Sometimes these groups maintained order, but they could also become tools for prejudice, vendettas, or mob violence. The iconic quick-draw gunfight image was largely a later invention. Most frontier violence was mundane, impulsive, and alcohol-fueled. Bar fights escalating to fatal levels, domestic violence, and disputes over land or livestock were far more common than dramatic street duels. Criminal punishment was harsh by modern standards. Hanging was standard for murder, rape, and sometimes theft, especially of horses or cattle. Prisons were primitive, with high mortality from disease, violence, and poor conditions. Many communities preferred immediate execution to expensive long-term imprisonment. As evening approaches, you seek shelter for the night. If lucky, you find a town with a hotel or boarding house. Don't expect luxury. Frontier accommodations were basic at best. A typical hotel room had a simple bed, possibly infested with bedbugs, a washstand with pitcher and basin, and perhaps a single chair. Bathroom facilities were typically an outhouse at the back, shared by all guests. Privacy was minimal, with thin walls that allowed you to hear every movement and conversation of your neighbors. In busier establishments, you might even share a bed with a stranger, a common practice to maximize capacity during peak periods. The sheets might not have been changed from previous guests, and lighting was limited to candles or oil lamps. A night's lodging would cost between 25 cents and $1, depending on the establishment's quality and location. For many travelers, this represented a significant expense, equivalent to several hours' wages for an average worker. Many chose to sleep in stables, barns, or simply under the stars to save money, despite the added risks these options presented. Traveling through remote areas often meant camping for the night. This involved building a fire if you could find enough fuel, preparing a meal from limited supplies, and sleeping on the ground with minimal protection from the elements or wildlife. Indigenous peoples, experienced travelers, and military scouts had sophisticated techniques for safe camping, but the average settler often made dangerous mistakes. Proper fire management was literally a matter of life and death. A fire built too large could spark a prairie or forest fire that consumed thousands of acres in hours. One built too small might fail to provide enough warmth during cold nights, leading to hypothermia. Campfire cooking required skills most modern people lack, often producing meals that were simultaneously burnt and raw. As night fully falls and you prepare to sleep, the sounds of the frontier surround you. Coyotes howl in the distance, unfamiliar birds call, and the wind whispers through grass or trees. For people accustomed to modern light and noise, the profound darkness and strange wilderness sounds often triggered intense anxiety. Many travelers slept poorly on the frontier, not only from physical discomfort, but from fear of unknown dangers lurking in the dark. Native attacks, though rare, often occurred at dawn when sleepers were most vulnerable. Predators like wolves, bears, and mountain lions might investigate camps for food. Venomous snakes and scorpions sought warm places to rest, sometimes inside a sleeper's bedroll. Even without real threats, the stress of constant vigilance took its toll. Frontier diaries frequently mention exhaustion, not just from labor, but from the mental strain of perpetual alertness. Modern people accustomed to locks, alarms, and dense populations would find the vulnerability of frontier sleeping arrangements profoundly disturbing. As you drift towards sleep, you reflect on the day's journey. Travel in the Wild West bore almost no resemblance to its sanitized, romanticized portrayal in entertainment. It was grueling, dangerous, and uncomfortable beyond what most modern people could endure. The skills required, from navigation without maps to emergency repairs to safe firearm handling, took years to develop, and mistakes were often fatal. Darkness deepens, and the sounds of night creatures grow louder. Tomorrow will bring new challenges. If you survive the night, you may reach your destination or become just another unmarked grave along the trail, one more statistic in the perilous story of westward expansion. The Wild West forgave no weakness and offered no second chances. Every day survived was a victory against overwhelming odds. The new day dawns on the frontier, and you've survived the night, a victory in itself. As you rub the sleep from your eyes and stretch aching muscles, you contemplate the direction your frontier experience might take. Today, perhaps you'll try your luck in one of the booming mining towns where fortunes were supposedly made overnight. You've heard tales of the California gold rush, Nevada silver strikes, and Colorado mining booms. Stories of ordinary men finding nuggets the size of chicken eggs and becoming wealthy overnight drew hundreds of thousands west. What these stories don't mention are the brutal realities awaiting those chasing mineral dreams. Suppose you decide to try mining. What would that entail? First, you'd need to stake a claim, meaning finding unclaimed land with potential mineral deposits, a challenge by the 1870s, as the richest areas were claimed years earlier. If lucky enough to find a promising spot, you'd need to register your claim at the nearest government office and pay required fees, which could be substantial. Then the real work began. Mining was some of the most physically demanding labor imaginable. Placer mining required hours bent over in ice-cold mountain streams, sifting sediment with a pan or sluice box. Hands would crack and bleed from constant exposure to water and rough materials. Backs ached from the hunched position. After all that effort, finding a few tiny flakes of gold worth pennies was considered luck. Hard rock mining, digging for ore veins in mountains, was far more dangerous. Tunneling into unstable rock without modern safety equipment often led to cave-ins that crushed miners. Poorly ventilated shafts filled with toxic, odorless gases like carbon monoxide suffocated miners with no warning. Blasting with black powder or dynamite was incredibly hazardous. Miners frequently lost fingers, hands, eyes, or lives when charges detonated prematurely or flying rock fragments struck them. The constant thunder of blasting left many with permanent hearing loss. Long-term health effects were severe. Miners inhaled fine dust leading to silicosis, a painful lung disease. Mercury used in gold processing caused neurological damage, tremors, and mental deterioration. Copper and lead miners absorbed toxic metals accumulating in their bodies, causing chronic illness and early death. Mining in the 1870s had virtually no safety regulations. Owners prioritized profit over worker welfare, viewing injuries as part of the job. Medical care was minimal and ineffective. A serious injury could end a miner's career and livelihood with no disability support or workers' compensation. And the reward, despite myths of lucky prospectors, most miners barely earned subsistence wages. By the 1870s, many worked for large mining companies, earning $2 to $3 for grueling 10 to 12-hour days. Studies suggest storekeepers, saloon owners, and prostitutes consistently made more money than miners whose labor sustained frontier towns. Mining towns were notoriously rough. Communities composed mostly of young single men engaged in dangerous work, with few women, families, or institutions created a volatile environment. Alcohol consumption was astronomical. Violence, fights, stabbings, shootings was common. Sanitation was abysmal. Human waste and garbage clogged streets and waterways. Typhoid, cholera, and dysentery spread rapidly. In warm months, the stench could be overwhelming, with flies transmitting disease from waste to food. Even if you found valuable ore, converting it to cash was challenging. Banking was primitive and often predatory. Many mining towns had no banks, forcing miners to carry gold, dust, or ore, making them targets for theft. Some saloons or general stores offered to buy gold, often at rates far below value. Where banks existed, they operated with minimal regulation. Bank failures were common, wiping out life savings without warning. Many bankers were little more than confidence men who disappeared overnight with deposits. Without federally backed currency, paper money issued by individual banks fluctuated wildly in value. Counterfeit bills circulated widely, fooling even experienced merchants. Gold or silver coins were safest, but carrying them made one a robbery target. Perhaps you decide to try ranching instead. The cattle industry was booming in the 1870s, driven by Eastern demand for beef. Surely this seemed a healthier, more profitable venture. Ranching avoided some mining hazards, but introduced its own dangers. Starting a ranch required significant capital. Land, livestock, equipment, and buildings all demanded major investment. Many aspiring ranchers went deeply into debt, betting their future on favorable weather and market conditions. Nature often had other plans. Droughts could wither grazing lands and dry up vital water sources, forcing ranchers to watch helplessly as cattle starved or sell at devastating losses. Harsh winters could decimate entire herds. The infamous Great Die-Up of 1886-1887 saw up to 90% of cattle on northern ranges perish from cold and starvation during unusually severe weather. Disease could strike suddenly, wiping out a rancher's investment overnight. Texas fever, anthrax, and other infectious illnesses had no effective treatments in the 1870s. Predators like wolves and cougars constantly preyed on livestock, especially vulnerable calves. Poisonous plants, quicksand, and accidental injuries further reduced herd numbers. The iconic cattle drives, hundreds of miles to railroad shipping points were far from romantic adventures. Cowboys, typically young and poorly paid, worked grueling 20-hour days during these drives, catching brief naps in the saddle while moving thousands of animals across rough terrain. The drives were fraught with danger. River crossings could become deadly in moments if cattle panicked, causing pileups that drowned both animals and cowboys. Stampedes could be triggered by lightning, snapping twigs, or even sudden noises, turning thousands of 1,500-pound animals into unstoppable, destructive forces. Cowboys caught in the path were often trampled to death. Life as a cowboy offered little of the freedom portrayed in Western myths. Most earned about $30 per month for exhausting, dangerous work. Many were teenagers from poor families with few other options. A significant number were Black, Mexican, or mixed race, facing discrimination that limited their opportunities elsewhere. Meals on the trail consisted mainly of beans, salt pork, and biscuits, with minimal fresh food. Medical care was rudimentary, limited to folk remedies known by trail cooks. Injuries often went untreated until life-threatening. Many cowboys died young from exposure, violence, or accident. Perhaps ranching seems unappealing. Farming might appear a safer, more stable way of life. The Homestead Act of 1862 opened vast western lands to settlers, offering 160 acres free to anyone willing to live on and improve the land for 5 years. This seemed an incredible opportunity, a chance for people with little money to become landowners. Reality proved far harsher. In arid regions, 160 acres was often insufficient to support a family. Traditional Eastern farming methods failed under the sparse rainfall of the plains, and many settlers lacked knowledge of dry farming techniques crucial for success. Starting a frontier farm required immense physical labor. The first task was building shelter, often a sod house on the treeless plains. These dwellings, made by cutting and stacking dense prairie turf, were dark, damp, leaked during rain, harbored insects and snakes, and required constant maintenance. Then came the back-breaking work of breaking the soil for planting. Prairie sod, held together by roots developed over centuries, was extraordinarily difficult to plow with the equipment most settlers had. Preparing a few acres could take over a year, permanently damaging the farmer's body. Once planted, crops faced threats from every direction. Droughts could wither plants. Torrential rains could wash away seedlings or flood fields. Early frosts could destroy crops just before harvest. Biblical swarms of grasshoppers sometimes consumed everything green, including tool handles left in the fields. Illness struck families at inopportune times, often during crucial planting or harvesting periods, leaving survival or starvation hanging in the balance. Women often worked the fields while heavily pregnant or days after giving birth, because the work could not wait. Farm accidents were common, sometimes fatal. Homemade tools broke, animals panicked and trampled handlers, and even successful harvests could become deadly. Farmers occasionally suffocated in grain storage bins or perished when poorly built storage buildings collapsed under heavy loads. Isolation took a heavy psychological toll. Neighbors might live miles away, visited only occasionally. Women often went months without speaking to anyone outside their immediate family. Depression, anxiety, and prairie madness affected many settlers, sometimes leading to abandonment of homesteads or suicide. Even for those who persevered and produced crops, economic challenges remained. Transportation to markets was difficult and expensive. Perishable products had to be sold quickly or preserved. Large agricultural corporations and railroad companies manipulated prices and transportation costs, squeezing independent farmers from both ends. By the 1870s, another frontier option emerged: wage labor in growing towns and industries. While avoiding some of the extreme dangers and financial risks of mining, ranching, or farming, wage work had its own hardships. Industrial safety standards were virtually non-existent. Factory, mill, and workshop workers suffered horrific injuries from unguarded machinery. Construction workers built taller structures without harnesses, leading to frequent fatal falls. Railroad labor was brutal. Track layers worked under harsh conditions, facing high rates of injury and death from accidents, heat stroke, and exhaustion. Chinese laborers on the transcontinental railroad were often assigned the most dangerous tasks, handling unstable explosives, in mountain passes. Workdays were long, typically 10-12 hours, 6 days a week. Pay was minimal, often barely enough for subsistence. Child labor was widespread, with children as young as 8 or 9 working alongside adults, suffering higher injury rates due to inexperience. Legal protections were virtually non-existent. Employers could fire workers without cause, reduce wages arbitrarily, or withhold pay. Workers attempting to organize for better conditions risked blacklisting. Company towns, settlements where a single employer owned all housing and businesses, were common in mining and lumber regions. Workers paid inflated prices at company stores, lived in company housing, and were sometimes paid in company script instead of legal currency. This created a form of debt bondage, making escape nearly impossible. Whether mining, ranching, farming, or wage work, frontier life shaped experiences in ways modern people would find disorienting. Perhaps most striking was the relationship with time, not the precise, minute-by-minute measurement of today, but a more fluid rhythm governed by daylight, seasons, and natural cycles. Without electric lighting, most woke at dawn and slept shortly after sunset. Active hours expanded and contracted with the seasons. Work wasn't measured in 8-hour shifts but by tasks: fields plowed, cattle moved, or extracted. During harvest or cattle roundups, people worked from first light until well after dark for weeks without rest. Winter brought relative inactivity when fields lay dormant or cattle required minimal tending. Punctuality, so central today, held limited relevance. Few clocks existed, and approximate schedules, morning or after dinner, were sufficient for most tasks, aside from stagecoaches or trains. Entertainment and leisure bore little resemblance to modern forms. After exhausting days, most settlers had little energy for elaborate pastimes. Evening conversation around the fire, storytelling, or simple card games were common. Music, when instruments and players were available, offered social enjoyment. Fiddles, harmonicas, and guitars provided accompaniment for dances. Reading material was precious, often shared among neighbors until books fell apart. Newspapers, when available, were scrutinized for every advertisement and notice. Organized sports existed in simple forms. Baseball was gaining popularity, played on makeshift fields with minimal equipment. Horse racing, wrestling, and shooting competitions offered entertainment and a chance to demonstrate practical skills. Children played games requiring little or no equipment, inventing fun from imagination alone. Games and play remained vital, especially for children. Tag, hide-and-seek, and variations of stickball played with found objects filled the long hours. Holidays and community gatherings offered rare occasions for socializing and recreation. 4th of July celebrations drew people from miles around for picnics, speeches, games, and dancing. Harvest festivals marked the completion of critical yearly work. Religious holidays provided both spiritual meaning and welcome breaks from routine. As evening falls, the relentlessness of frontier life becomes clear. Every task demanded more effort, every risk was greater, and comforts were few compared to the modern world. Those who survived, and sometimes thrived, needed extraordinary physical endurance, practical problem-solving skills, and psychological resilience to endure constant hardship and loss. Night on the frontier brought a profound silence. No engines, no air conditioning, no hum of electronics, only the whisper of wind, insects, and distant nightbirds. This alien quiet could be both comforting and unsettling. Drifting towards sleep, you might wonder whether you could survive here, not for a day, but for years. The people who shaped the American West were not the idealized heroes of later fiction, but complex individuals navigating extraordinary challenges with limited resources and knowledge. Stripped of romanticism, their story is one of human endurance against conditions that would overwhelm most today. The night sky, however, offered a rare and pure beauty, the Milky Way stretching across truly dark skies, a sight few modern people can fully appreciate, connecting settlers to the same cosmic panorama their ancestors had watched for generations. Morning arrives again, bringing hunger, the constant companion of frontier life. Food in the 1870s West bore little resemblance to modern diets. Game was still relatively plentiful in many regions. Deer, elk, rabbits, and birds could supplement a family's diet if they possessed the skills and ammunition to hunt, both expensive and often needed for protection. Hunting also required time away from other essential work, making it a luxury many settlers could not afford. Most families relied on what they could grow, preserve, or purchase in bulk. Staples included beans, corn, and pork, dense in calories but monotonous and nutritionally limited. Fresh fruits and vegetables were seasonal, often unavailable during winter. Nutritional deficiencies were common. Scurvy caused by lack of vitamin C appeared during winter and early spring, resulting in bleeding gums, joint pain, and in severe cases, death. Other deficiencies stunted children and caused chronic health problems in adults. Preserving food was essential for survival. Without refrigeration, meat had to be eaten quickly or preserved through smoking, salting, or drying. These methods deterred bacterial growth but altered flavor, texture, and nutritional value. Heavy salt consumption contributed to hypertension and other health issues. Women spent countless hours preserving food during times of abundance for use during scarcity. Vegetables were pickled or fermented, fruits dried or preserved with sugar if available, root vegetables stored in underground cellars. Improper preparation could cause spoilage and deadly food poisoning. Stored food also attracted pests, rats, mice, and insects, forcing families to accept contamination as an unavoidable reality. Cooking was labor-intensive. Meals were prepared over open hearths or wood-burning stoves, requiring constant attention and fuel. In treeless plains, women and children might spend hours gathering buffalo chips, dried manure, or twisted prairie grass for cooking. Water, often hundreds of pounds per day, had to be hauled from wells or streams. Meals lacked variety and flavor by modern standards. Spices, sugar, and coffee were expensive luxuries, often hoarded for special occasions. Fresh milk came only when a family kept a cow, and even then, only part of the year. Children grew up on simple, repetitive diets that would alarm modern nutritionists. Obesity was rare, but leanness often masked malnutrition despite sufficient caloric intake. Raising children presented unique challenges. Childhood was conceived differently in the 19th century. By age 6 or 7, children contributed essential labor, minding livestock, gathering eggs, tending crops, or caring for younger siblings. By 10 or 12, children worked alongside adults at nearly adult capacity. Boys learned trades and fieldwork directly from fathers. Girls mastered domestic production, including clothing, preserved food, candles, and soap. Frontier children were exposed to life's harsh realities from an early age: births, deaths, animal slaughter, and community violence. Education, where available, was limited. Schools, often a single room for children aged 5 to 17, operated for only a few months each year, typically in winter. Conditions were harsh: poorly insulated buildings, minimal supplies, slates instead of paper, and corporal punishment for minor infractions. In remote areas, formal education was absent. Families taught practical skills: predicting weather, tracking animals, preparing soil, treating injuries, knowledge essential for survival. Child mortality remained devastatingly high. Roughly 1 in 4 children died before adulthood, with the highest risk in the first 5 years. Diseases like measles, diphtheria, scarlet fever, and whooping cough routinely killed or disabled children. Accidents claimed many more. Most children grew up witnessing siblings die. Parents expected to lose children and often reused the same names for subsequent births, a reflection of the era's relationship with mortality. Health care was primitive. If you became ill or injured, professional medical care was scarce. Doctors were few, often minimally trained, relying on brief apprenticeships or short stints at medical colleges. Their knowledge leaned heavily on outdated theories, such as humoral balance, more reminiscent of medieval medicine than modern practice. Without professional medical care, most health issues were managed through home remedies and folk medicine. Every community had individuals, usually women, recognized for their healing skills, drawing from traditions brought from various cultures. Some treatments, especially herbal remedies, had genuine medicinal value. Many, however, were ineffective or harmful. Bloodletting weakened already ill patients. Laxatives were given to expel bad humors, often causing severe dehydration. Poultices applied to wounds sometimes introduced infection rather than preventing it. Laudanum, a tincture of opium, was widely used for pain, creating widespread addiction. Mercury compounds were prescribed for numerous ailments, despite their toxicity. Even when remedies were valid, The lack of regulation meant dosage and purity varied wildly, and commercially sold medicines could contain dangerous contaminants. Patent cure-all tonics were often mostly alcohol, giving temporary relief through intoxication rather than true healing. Surgery on the frontier was particularly horrific. Anesthesia beyond alcohol, whiskey, or opium was rare. Patients endured excruciating pain during procedures. Sterilization was unknown or inconsistently applied, resulting in rampant infections. Amputation was a standard treatment for serious limb injuries, performed with saws and knives wiped clean but never truly sterilized. Childbirth starkly illustrated the dangers of frontier medicine. Most women delivered at home, attended by a midwife if one was available, or by female relatives if not. Prenatal care was virtually non-existent. Complications such as breech births or hemorrhages often proved fatal for mother, child, or both. Maternal mortality on the frontier was roughly 1 death per 100 births, more than 100 times higher than in modern developed countries. Women faced each pregnancy knowing it could be their last. Diaries and letters frequently recount men raising children alone after losing wives in childbirth. The cumulative impact of poor nutrition, relentless physical labor, minimal preventive care, and primitive treatments meant frontier populations experienced health outcomes closer to those of modern developing nations than contemporary America. Life expectancy at birth was under 40 years. Even those surviving childhood often endured chronic health problems by their 50s if they lived that long. Beyond material hardships, the psychological toll of frontier life was profound. Isolation shaped culture, community, and individual psychology. Communication with distant relatives or friends relied on physical transport. Letters took weeks or months to arrive, and news traveled slowly, often distorted. Remote settlers existed in a highly localized world where events hundreds of miles away seemed abstract and irrelevant. For women, isolation could be extreme. Cut off from friends and family for days or weeks while husbands traveled, many recorded the debilitating loneliness in their diaries. Extended solitude, relentless work, and harsh conditions sometimes led to prairie madness, severe depression, anxiety, psychosis, or even violence. Some abandoned their homesteads entirely, unable to endure the mental strain. Even in established towns, social life was limited by practical realities. Visiting neighbors might involve several miles of travel by foot or horseback. Formal gatherings occurred rarely, centered on church services, seasonal celebrations, or collective work events such as barn raisings or harvest festivals. Churches were far more than places of worship. They functioned as community hubs, schools, and mutual aid centers. Ministers, priests, and lay preachers often served as teachers, mediators, and organizers. The establishment of institutions marked a commitment to permanence. Building a school, church, or meeting hall transformed temporary settlements into communities with shared identities. Likewise, creating local governments signaled a shift from chaotic frontier conditions to organized society. Frontier communities also developed informal systems of mutual aid. Neighbors helped one another with barn raisings, crop planting, harvests, and emergency needs. This collective action was essential for survival in a world where isolation, natural hazards, and limited resources meant few could endure alone. Every handshake, shared meal, and cooperative labor effort was a vital thread in the fabric of frontier life. Diversity in the frontier created a tapestry of cultures rarely captured in Hollywood narratives. Chinese immigrants labored on railroads, in mines, and as merchants, often enduring the most dangerous jobs for lower pay while facing constant discrimination. Mexican communities in the Southwest had existed long before U.S. expansion, yet their landholdings and livelihoods were frequently undermined through legal manipulation or outright theft following the Mexican-American War. Black settlers, many hopping to escape the South's entrenched racism, encountered prejudice in different forms, even as they contributed essential labor in ranching, farming, and town building. European immigrants, Germans, Irish, Italians, Scandinavians, brought traditions, language, and specialized skills that shaped local economies and communities. Despite these contributions, equality was largely a myth. Social hierarchies often dictated opportunity, safety, and access to resources. Violence could erupt along racial, cultural, or economic lines. Tensions over land, water, and employment sometimes led to tragic outcomes. Communities were microcosms of negotiation, conflict, and cooperation, constantly balancing survival against prejudice and scarcity. Trade, cooperation, and shared labor were necessary to keep towns functioning. Blacksmiths, carpenters, coopers, and milliners formed networks that sustained frontier economies. Informal courts, town meetings, and vigilante groups enforced rules where official law enforcement was scarce. Justice was pragmatic and immediate rather than procedural, often favoring resolution over fairness. Mistakes could be fatal. Accusations of theft or assault sometimes led to summary punishment or lynching. These communities developed a rough moral code, a mixture of self-interest, neighborly obligation, and survival instinct. Yet within this roughness, moments of culture, art, and connection thrived. Fiddlers and guitar players brought music to saloons and homes. Stories passed orally, carrying news, wisdom, and entertainment. Churches, schools, and social gatherings created fleeting spaces of safety, learning, and social cohesion. Even amid hunger, disease, and environmental danger, people found ways to celebrate harvests, commemorate victories, and mourn losses together. The daily reality of the frontier demanded an extraordinary combination of skills: endurance, labor, negotiation, and adaptability. Each day brought new hazards, from sudden storms to predatory animals, from accidents to illness. Those who survived did so not by luck alone, but by mastering a delicate balance of individual resourcefulness and collective reliance. The frontier shaped not only physical survival, but also a worldview rooted in resilience, pragmatism, and a constant awareness of mortality. As night falls again on the plains, mountains, or desert, the air grows still. Crickets chirp, coyotes call in the distance, and the sky darkens into an ink-black canvas sprinkled with stars. This was the true soundtrack of the Wild West, a world both breathtaking and unforgiving, where beauty and danger existed in equal measure. You close your eyes, letting the lessons of the day settle. The quiet heroism of ordinary people, the costs of expansion and survival, and the enduring echoes of cultures, struggles, and choices that shaped the land. The frontier was never a place of easy victories or cinematic showdowns. Its reality was harsher, more complex, and infinitely more human. And yet, in its hardships, communities persisted, cultures intersected, and lives were lived with courage, ingenuity, and a tenacity that modern comfort can scarcely imagine. The mythology of the Wild West thrived because it provided a narrative that was simultaneously thrilling, moralizing, and comforting to audiences far removed from the hardships of frontier life. It offered clear heroes and villains, dramatic confrontations, and the illusion of freedom and opportunity, all packaged in digestible, emotionally satisfying stories. The complexities of daily survival, the nuanced interactions between diverse communities, and the constant threat of disease, environmental disaster, and economic exploitation were largely erased or simplified. Frontier realities, the grinding labor, high mortality, systemic inequalities, and environmental destruction were inconvenient for storytelling. Buffalo Bill's shows, dime novels, and later silent films presented a West of gunfights at high noon, fearless lawmen, noble outlaws, and stoic pioneers tamming wild landscapes. Indigenous peoples were often depicted as antagonists, reduced to stereotypes or romanticized noble savages, erasing their rich cultures, sophisticated economies, and the ongoing devastation caused by U.S. expansion. Women's labor and influence, African American and Chinese contributions, and the everyday courage of ordinary settlers were largely invisible in these narratives. Yet these myths served a social function. They helped a rapidly industrializing nation reconcile with the closing of the frontier, providing a sense of continuity with a rugged, self-reliant past. They framed westward expansion as a triumph of civilization and manifest destiny, glossing over the violence, dispossession, and cultural destruction it entailed. The romanticized West became a template for American identity itself. Independent, daring, resilient, and morally certain, even if the historical reality was far more morally complex and physically demanding. As night falls on your final evening in this imagined West, you are left with a layered understanding. You've seen the hardships, the isolation, disease, accidents, and economic precarity. You've witnessed the diversity of peoples and the tensions that accompanied it. You've experienced the mental and physical fortitude required to survive, and sometimes thrive, on the frontier. And you've understood how these real experiences were transformed into enduring myths that shaped national memory. The stars emerge overhead, as brilliant and untouched as they were for settlers, indigenous peoples, and travelers of the 19th century. In their quiet, cosmic sweep, you sense both the permanence of the land and the fleeting, fragile lives of those who inhabited it. The Wild West, in truth, was not a stage for romanticized adventures, but a proving ground for human resilience and adaptability. Its legacy, filtered through myth, continues to influence American culture, identity, and our collective imagination, reminding us of what was endured, what was lost, and what was built through sheer determination and courage. This concludes your journey through the real Wild West, a world of hardship, diversity, endurance, and human complexity far beyond the legends we've come to know. As the echoes of hooves, wind, and distant coyotes fade into memory, you carry with you an understanding that the frontier was not merely a place, but a crucible of human experience. It shaped identities, forged communities, and tested resilience in ways that modern life rarely demands. Every homestead built, every crop harvested, every life saved or lost contributed to a story far richer and more complicated than any dime novel or silver screen adventure. In the quiet of your mind, you can still see the endless prairies stretching toward the horizon, the jagged peaks of mountains, the deep canyons carved by rivers, and the night sky unpolluted by city lights. You feel the weight of generations who navigated these landscapes with only the tools, knowledge, and grit they could muster. Their courage was not the flashy heroism of gunfights and duels, but the quiet persistence of people surviving, adapting, and sometimes thriving under conditions that would test any modern imagination. And as you rest, remember that the frontier lives on, not in myths, but in the values it inspired: ingenuity in the face of scarcity, the necessity of cooperation, the stubborn determination to persevere, and the humbling awareness of nature's power. These are the legacies of those who walked the West before us, written not in Hollywood scripts, but in the soil they tilled, the towns they built, and the stories they quietly left behind. Tonight, as sleep carries you further into dreams, imagine standing beneath that same star-strewn sky, feeling the cool night air, hearing the soft rustle of grass and distant calls of wildlife. The frontier was unforgiving, yet breathtakingly beautiful, a world where human life and the natural world intersected in ways that demanded respect, skill, and endurance. In these reflections, you honor the real Wild West, harsh, magnificent, and profoundly human. Sleep now, carrying with you the lessons, struggles, and quiet heroism of a time that shaped a nation, a landscape, and the enduring spirit of those who dared to face it. Even as the frontier recedes into history, its echoes remain in the rhythm of human life, the rhythms of labor and rest, of risk and reward, of community and solitude. You might notice how modern comforts, once taken for granted, owe their existence to generations who carved stability from chaos. The irrigation channels, fences, towns, and trails they built still guide our movements, even if the original users are long gone. Consider, too, the resilience born from isolation. Those who endured long winters, scorching summers, and endless droughts developed a capacity to observe subtle patterns in the natural world. They could read the clouds and the wind, predict the movements of animals, anticipate the coming of storms, and judge the fertility of the soil. In these observations, a profound connection to the environment was formed, one of attentiveness, respect, and necessity. Every decision, from planting crops to moving cattle, was grounded in a practical understanding of the land, knowledge often transmitted orally or learned through trial, error, and sometimes heartbreak. Modern life, buffered by technology, has largely obscured this intimate engagement with natural rhythms, yet the frontier's lessons still linger in rural practices and ecological management. The endurance demanded of frontier settlers was not purely physical, but profoundly mental and emotional. Isolation, the monotony of labor, and the omnipresent awareness of mortality shaped character in ways that seem almost alien to contemporary experience. People faced moments when life itself hung in balance, children's illnesses that today would be treated with a simple injection, livestock lost to disease or predators, homes threatened by fire or flood. Each challenge required immediate action, ingenuity, and often sacrifice. A successful day was measured not by recognition or profit alone, but by the survival of the household, the care of family, and the integrity of one's property. The stakes were tangible, immediate, and relentless. Yet amid this struggle, moments of grace and human connection persisted. Shared labor forged bonds that could survive years of hardship. Neighbors helped one another harvest crops before a sudden frost destroyed weeks of work, or raised barns and homes together in collective efforts that transcended personal gain. Children, taught the necessity of work from an early age, learned cooperation, responsibility, and practical skills that would define them for life. Women, whose labor formed the backbone of household survival, demonstrated ingenuity in preserving food, tending to the sick, and managing scarce resources. Their work was often invisible to later mythmakers, yet it sustained the very life of the frontier communities. The frontier was also a crucible of diversity. Its settlements were multicultural mosaics, far more varied than Hollywood depictions suggest. Indigenous peoples, immigrants from Europe, Chinese laborers, African Americans, Mexicans, and settlers from the eastern United States all converged, each bringing traditions, languages, and practices shaped by different experiences. These interactions were sometimes cooperative, sometimes tense, often both simultaneously. Trade, labor, and cultural exchange occurred alongside discrimination, exclusion, and conflict. Understanding this dynamic is essential, for it reveals that the story of the West is not merely one of rugged individuals tamming a wilderness, but of overlapping human networks negotiating survival, identity, and belonging. Within these networks, violence was both a reality and a myth. Frontier life demanded vigilance, but the legendary figures of gunfighters, outlaws, and lawmen occupied only small corners of the broader experience. Most settlers, miners, and ranchers lived in communities where negotiation, consensus, and mutual assistance were far more common strategies for survival than duels or ambushes. Yet the myths endure because they serve human needs. Stories of bravery, danger, and morality distilled into clear narratives are easier to digest than the complex, often morally ambiguous realities of everyday life. Recognizing the difference between myth and reality is crucial to understanding the frontier not as entertainment, but as history. Consider the impact of environmental transformation. The West that travelers and settlers encountered was rich in biodiversity, expansive grasslands, forests, and wildlife. But by the end of the 19th century, much of it had been altered irrevocably. The near-extermination of the American bison, once numbering in the tens of millions, was both a consequence of hunting for hides and an intentional policy to displace indigenous peoples. Timberlands were felled for construction, fueling, and mining, leaving scars still visible in the landscape. Rivers were diverted and dammed, streams polluted by industrial waste, soil eroded by overgrazing and poorly managed agriculture. The frontier, in short, was not just a human challenge, it was an environmental experiment with consequences that persist to this day. Understanding this interplay between human ambition and natural systems offers insight into modern environmental dilemmas, reminding us that the decisions of those who came before echo across time and space. Food, health, and sustenance, as you have seen, were far from trivial concerns. The monotony of beans, pork, and corn, supplemented by hunted game when possible, defined survival. Knowledge of preservation, drying, smoking, pickling was essential, as was the ability to improvise when supplies ran low. Nutrition was limited, disease pervasive, and medical knowledge rudimentary at best. Maternal and child mortality rates were high, injuries often fatal, and epidemics of measles, scarlet fever, and influenza claimed thousands. Yet families adapted, using traditional knowledge, folk remedies, and community support networks to endure. In this context, survival itself was a measure of skill, foresight, and fortitude, and each small victory, harvest completed, child-grown, home rebuilt after fire, represented a triumph against overwhelming odds. Perhaps most striking is the psychological endurance demanded of frontier life. Isolation could crush the spirit, yet it also cultivated patience, observation, and self-reliance. People developed a sense of time rooted not in clocks, but in natural cycles, the rising and setting sun, the changing seasons, the movement of animals. Days were measured by tasks completed rather than hours elapsed. Life became a series of practical challenges, each requiring attention and effort, and each offering immediate feedback. Failure was visible and often irreversible, yet it offered lessons as tangible as any textbook. This rhythm, this intimate engagement with both nature and labor, fostered a type of resilience difficult to replicate in the comfort and safety of modern life. In reflecting on these experiences, you may notice that the legacy of the frontier persists far beyond historical accounts. Modern America, with its laws, land policies, and cultural narratives, carries echoes of the frontier in its structure and mindset. The tension between individual rights and community responsibility, local governance and federal oversight, conservation and exploitation, all find their roots in this period of rapid expansion and intense challenge. Even the myths themselves, though historically inaccurate, shape how Americans understand identity, morality, and courage. They reveal a yearning for simplicity, autonomy, and valor amid adversity, values distilled from a complex and often brutal reality. Yet to fully honor the frontier, one must acknowledge those left out of the myths. Indigenous peoples endured dispossession, cultural erasure, and violence. Immigrants faced discrimination and legal exclusion. Women's labor, though essential, was often invisible. The frontier was not merely a proving ground for rugged masculinity or a canvas for individual heroism. It was a shared space of negotiation, compromise, exploitation, and endurance. Recognizing these perspectives enriches our understanding, providing a fuller picture of the forces that shaped not only the West, but the nation as a whole. As you lie in the quiet of your own time, consider the perspective of someone gazing at the same stars over the plains or the mountains a century and a half ago. Those stars guided travel, measured time, and offered solace. They were constants in a world defined by unpredictability. For frontier people, the night sky was both practical and profoundly moving, a reminder of the vastness of the world, the continuity of life, and the small but enduring role of human endeavor. Their connection to these celestial rhythms grounded daily life, inspired reflection, and fostered a sense of shared humanity that transcended individual circumstance. The frontier experience also reminds us of the fragility and adaptability of human communities. When faced with extreme scarcity, threat, or isolation, people either succumbed or innovated, collaborated, and persevered. This duality, vulnerability, and ingenuity defines the human story, offering lessons that resonate far beyond the historical West. Today, we may face different challenges, technological, social, environmental, but the frontier mindset, that combination of resilience, observation, cooperation, and courage, remains instructive. Finally, there is a beauty in the unembellished truth of frontier life. Stripped of cinematic exaggeration, the real West offers moments of wonder, the shimmer of a prairie sunrise, the sudden flight of birds at dusk, the wind across a frozen river, the quiet persistence of life in a harsh landscape. It is a beauty earned through endurance, observed through labor and attentiveness, and appreciated because it is fleeting and hard-won. The frontier teaches that the human experience, in all its struggle and complexity, is inseparable from the environment that shapes it, and that courage is found not only in epic feats, but in the steady, determined effort to survive and thrive day after day. As sleep finally takes you, remember the courage and endurance of those who lived on the frontier. Remember the farmers, the cowboys, the miners, the immigrants, the indigenous peoples, the women, and the children. Remember their mistakes and successes, their cooperation and conflict, their suffering and their joy. Their stories, both tragic and inspiring, form the foundation of a modern world that often takes for granted the comforts and stability they never knew. In dreams, perhaps, you walk among the plains and mountains, hear the creak of wagon wheels, the laughter of children at play, and the whisper of wind through grass that has witnessed centuries of human striving. The frontier is gone, but its lessons remain, about the endurance of the human spirit, the necessity of cooperation, the consequences of ambition, and the profound connection between people and the land they inhabit. Sleep now, carrying with you this understanding. Let it settle in your consciousness, a quiet meditation on hardship, ingenuity, and the deep currents of history that shape the world we inhabit. For even as we live in a world of abundance and technology, the echoes of the frontier remind us of what it means to persevere, to connect, and to face life, with all its risks and beauty, head-on. And so the journey ends. You awaken not in the West of the 1870s, but in your own time, enriched by the memory of those who came before. You carry with you not only knowledge, but a visceral sense of the endurance, resilience, and quiet heroism that defined a people and a place. The real Wild West, harsh, magnificent, and profoundly human, remains alive, if only in memory, reflection, and the stories we continue to tell. As you stretch and move in your modern surroundings, the echoes of the frontier linger in your mind. You notice the subtle contrasts between your life and theirs. The heat of a midday sun no longer threatens your crops. Food appears on demand, rather than being painstakingly grown, hunted, or preserved. Water flows freely from taps, warm and cold at the turn of a knob. Medicine, once a tenuous hope in the form of tinctures, powders, and folk remedies, is now measured in precise doses and delivered by professionals trained for years. Yet with all these conveniences, there is a quiet longing, a curiosity about what it meant to live so closely aligned with the natural world, to measure time not by clocks, but by the length of a shadow or the migration of birds. The frontier was more than a physical space, it was a state of mind. Each decision carried weight, and the consequences of failure could be immediate and unforgiving. Settlers learned to live with uncertainty, to adapt to the unpredictable rhythms of weather, crops, and human behavior. They understood that survival was never guaranteed and that life's value lay not in comfort, but in perseverance, skill, and creativity. Even leisure was purposeful. A 4th of July picnic, a harvest festival, or a community dance was not merely recreation, but a reinforcement of social bonds and a reminder that humanity could flourish even amid hardship. You might imagine yourself walking the dusty streets of a frontier town, hearing the clatter of wagon wheels, the laughter of children at play, and the low murmur of neighbors exchanging news. Some faces are familiar, shaped by generations of migration, hardship, and adaptation. Others reflect the tensions of a diverse and often divided population. The Irish, German, Scandinavian, Chinese, Mexican, African American, and native peoples all intersect here, each contributing to the community's survival, each navigating both opportunity and oppression. In their interactions, you see the raw humanity of the frontier, acts of kindness and cruelty, solidarity and conflict, innovation and stubborn tradition. These communities were fragile yet remarkably resilient. A barn raising, a harvest crew, a spontaneous search party for a lost child, all demonstrate how cooperation and interdependence were not just idealized values, but necessary strategies for life itself. Without neighbors willing to lend muscle, skills, or advice, a family could fail, crops could rot, and livestock could perish. Even as individualism shaped myth and identity, the reality was one of mutual reliance. Human connection, painstakingly nurtured through daily interaction, was the foundation upon which survival rested. The physical demands of frontier life remain almost unimaginable. Women carrying water in pails weighing tens of pounds, children laboring from dawn to dusk, men clearing forests, plowing fields, hunting game, and repairing structures while exposed to the elements. Every day required skill, endurance, and the constant application of knowledge acquired through practice. Failure was never abstract, it had tangible consequences. A neglected fence meant lost livestock. A poorly stored crop meant famine during the long winter. A misjudged river crossing could cost life or limb. The frontier taught that even small mistakes could escalate into disaster, and that vigilance and attentiveness were not optional, but vital. Yet within these challenges, there were moments of wonder and quiet triumph. You can almost feel the pride of a family who successfully preserved meat through a bitter winter, the relief of a community that saved a child lost in the prairie, the satisfaction of completing a log cabin or a barn with nothing but hand tools and sweat. Every small success was magnified by its cost, the hours of labor, the exposure to risk, the uncertainty of the outcome. Modern comforts often obscure the depth of such achievements, but in the frontier, accomplishment was inseparable from endurance. The environmental context of the West shaped not just labor but perception. Settlers learned to read the landscape with a precision born of necessity, the color of the soil revealing fertility, the movement of clouds predicting storms, the behavior of animals indicating seasons. Nature was both adversary and teacher. Drought could destroy entire livelihoods, yet the same land offered vast resources if approached with knowledge and care. Rivers were highways and lifelines, mountains barriers and shelter, plains a canvas for cultivation and cattle. The land was neither passive nor forgiving, and in responding to it, humans developed a resilience and ingenuity rare in more temperate or resource-rich environments. Frontier medicine, as you have seen, demanded ingenuity under dire circumstances. A broken limb, an infection, or a fever often required immediate intervention, improvised with whatever tools and knowledge were at hand. Women's roles in these scenarios were vital. They were midwives, herbalists, and caretakers, applying skills passed down through generations or learned through trial and error. The absence of formal medical infrastructure forced communities to cultivate knowledge collectively, blending traditions from multiple cultures. While many treatments were imperfect or dangerous, the commitment to care, often under unimaginable stress, reflects a deep human capacity for resourcefulness and compassion. You remember, too, the cultural and social dimensions of the frontier. Churches, schools, and communal events created a fragile but vital structure for daily life. Even amidst hardship, people sought connection, education, and spiritual grounding. Children learned practical knowledge alongside literacy, counting, and moral instruction, understanding that survival required a blend of hands-on skill, observation, and intellect. Adults navigated both cooperation and competition, balancing self-interest with communal necessity. These structures, small yet critical, formed the backbone of emerging communities and reveal the adaptability of human societies in extreme conditions. The stories of outlaws, lawmen, and gunfighters, while captivating, pale in comparison to the broader human drama of the frontier. The legendary figures are remembered for spectacle, but ordinary people lived under the constant pressure of mortality, scarcity, and social complexity. Their courage was quieter, subtler, expressed in daily choices, sacrifices, and endurance. And while the myths provide entertainment, understanding the realities of life, where courage, ingenuity, and ethical choices intertwined, is far more instructive and humbling. The frontier also offers lessons in resilience that transcend time. When faced with scarcity, threat, or isolation, humans either falter or innovate. Communities either fracture or coalesce. Leadership emerges from necessity, not from ceremony, and every individual must navigate the balance between personal needs and collective well-being. These dynamics remain relevant today. Modern societies face crises, environmental challenges, social inequalities, and conflicts that demand similar combinations of ingenuity, cooperation, and moral judgment. The frontier is, in a sense, a mirror, reflecting what humans can endure and achieve under pressure. And then there is beauty, harsh, unforgiving, yet transcendent. The first light over prairie, the glitter of frost on a winter morning, the arc of the Milky Way over a desert canyon, the wind bending tall grasses in unison. These moments, though fleeting, carried meaning, solace, and inspiration. They remind us that even in the midst of toil and deprivation, humans are capable of wonder, reflection, and appreciation of the natural world. The frontier cultivated not only survival skills, but a profound sense of connection to the environment, one that modern life seldom requires, but can deeply enrich if sought. As you consider the totality of the frontier experience, the convergence of human, environmental, and cultural challenges becomes clear. Settlers, indigenous peoples, immigrants, and communities all navigated a complex web of survival, cooperation, and conflict. Misunderstandings, prejudices, and violence were real, yet so too were acts of generosity, mutual aid, and adaptation. The frontier was not a simplified landscape of heroes and villains. It was a living, breathing social ecosystem, shaped by decisions, chance, and the constant push and pull between humans and their environment. The lessons of the frontier extend to the present. They teach the value of practical knowledge, the importance of community, the necessity of resilience, and the profound consequences of environmental stewardship. They remind us that comfort and abundance are recent inventions, built on centuries of effort, ingenuity, and sacrifice. And they encourage reflection. How do we live in a world of conveniences without losing sight of human resourcefulness, empathy, and connection? How do we balance individual ambition with communal responsibility? How do we relate to the land that sustains us? As you drift once more into sleep, these thoughts linger. The frontier may no longer exist in physical form, but it persists in memory, in history, and in the lessons it offers. You carry with you the endurance of those who labored, the resilience of those who survived, and the courage of those who faced uncertainty with determination. In your own life, in your own community, the echoes of the frontier offer guidance, reflection, and inspiration. And perhaps most importantly, you are reminded that history is not only to be observed, but to be felt, experienced in empathy and imagination. The past is not a distant museum, but a living teacher, and in listening closely to its lessons, we may understand not only what it meant to live in the Wild West, but what it means to live as humans, navigating challenge, uncertainty, and opportunity. The frontier may be gone, but its spirit, quiet, enduring, and profoundly human, remains. In the end, the journey through the Wild West leaves you with a heightened awareness of endurance, of interdependence, of courage, and of the beauty that exists in challenge. The stories you carry are not of legends alone, but of lives lived fully, tragically, and heroically, in ways both ordinary and extraordinary. They invite reflection, not only on the past, but on the choices, struggles, and responsibilities that shape every generation. Sleep now, enveloped in this understanding, and allow the quiet heroism of the frontier to settle like a gentle weight on your consciousness. The real Wild West, as harsh and magnificent as it was, continues to teach. Its landscapes, communities, and legacies remain alive in the questions it asks, the challenges it presents, and the resilience it inspires. And as the stars twinkle above, unchanging across centuries, you realize that the frontier exists not only in history, but within the human capacity to endure, adapt, and find meaning in the vast, unpredictable world around us. Even as you settle back into your modern surroundings, the Wild West lingers in your mind, not as myth or legend, but as a visceral landscape of endurance, struggle, and extraordinary human adaptation. You begin to reflect on the lives that unfolded within this vast, unforgiving territory. The frontier was not just a collection of hardships, but a theater of daily courage, quiet innovation, and the relentless negotiation between human ambition and the environment. Consider the hours before dawn, when frontier families rose to tend crops, animals, and households. The world was still dark, often frigid in winter or damp with morning dew. A child's first task might be to fetch water from a distant well, carrying heavy buckets across frost-crusted ground. Older children helped with livestock, tending to cows, pigs, or chickens, learning early the responsibilities that modern schooling would defer for a decade or more. Every task carried significance. Missed chores could imperil survival, and success was measured in tangible outcomes rather than grades or praise. In these moments, life was distilled to its essentials: food, shelter, warmth, and safety. The rhythm of the day was dictated by nature itself. Sunlight guided planting and harvesting, rain could dictate schedules for weeks, blizzards could trap families indoors, forcing innovation or improvisation. Yet the frontier offered moments of unparalleled beauty. Imagine a canyon carved over millennia, its stone layers glowing golden in early sunlight, or the shimmer of frost across endless prairies, each blade of grass catching the first rays. The West demanded respect for its power, but also rewarded those who learned to read its signs. Winds, clouds, animal tracks, and river currents became teachers, conveying knowledge no book could fully capture. Frontier work was physically exhausting, yet it cultivated a form of resilience rarely demanded in modern life. A farmer clearing land with only a plow and horses developed endurance, judgment, and an intimate understanding of the soil. A hunter tracking deer or elk learned patience, observation, and the delicate balance of risk. Even domestic work required formidable skill, preserving meat and vegetables for winter, churning butter, making candles and soap, tending to the health of every family member. These were not chores, they were acts of survival, each imbued with responsibility and consequence. Children's experiences were particularly striking. Childhood on the frontier was not a protected stage, but an initiation into life's realities. They observed births and deaths, assisted with the preparation of meals that might sustain a family through months, and learned skills essential for their own survival. Yet amidst this weight of responsibility, there was joy. Children played games adapted to their environment, hide-and-seek among fence posts, stickball with makeshift equipment, or improvised toys crafted from scraps. These moments of leisure were brief but treasured, a reminder that even in adversity, human beings find ways to create happiness. Food, the constant concern of frontier life, reveals the ingenuity required to survive. Families relied on hunting, farming, and preservation techniques to sustain themselves through harsh winters. Beans, corn, and pork formed the backbone of the diet, supplemented occasionally by game or foraged plants. Preservation methods, smoking, salting, drying, ensured survival, but exacted a toll in taste, texture, and nutrition. Scurvy, malnutrition, and dietary deficiencies were common. The labor involved in preparing, storing, and protecting food from pests consumed enormous amounts of time and energy, yet was non-negotiable. Without this knowledge and diligence, survival was imperiled. Medicine, too, demanded resourcefulness. In the absence of professional care, frontier families relied on home remedies, midwives, and folk knowledge. Some treatments were surprisingly effective, others dangerous or fatal. Mercury compounds, bloodletting, and opium tinctures were common, often applied without understanding of dosage or consequence. Infection was a constant threat, and surgical procedures were agonizing, performed with little anesthetic. Childbirth, a routine part of life, carried mortality rates unimaginable today. Women endured these risks repeatedly, while families adapted to the possibility of loss with a stoicism born of necessity. Social structures, fragile yet vital, anchored these communities. Churches, schools, and communal gatherings provided more than instruction or worship. They fostered connection, mutual aid, and shared purpose. Even isolated families relied on these institutions to maintain psychological and practical support. Mutual reliance shaped culture. Barn raisings, harvest crews, and search parties reinforced the notion that survival required cooperation. Independence was celebrated in myth, but the reality demanded interdependence. These communities were intricate networks of obligation, trust, and negotiation, reflecting the nuanced interplay between individualism and collective responsibility. Conflict was ever present, often rooted in competition for scarce resources or cultural misunderstandings. Native Americans faced displacement, forced assimilation, and violence. Mexican and Chinese immigrants endured discrimination and loss of property. African Americans struggled against systemic bias, even in the hope of freedom. The frontier was a crucible for both cooperation and oppression. It forced people to navigate morality under pressure, balancing survival with justice, fairness with pragmatism. Ordinary acts, sharing water, assisting a neighbor, defending a claim, often carried profound ethical weight. The mythology of the West, from dime novels to Hollywood films, obscures these realities. Lone heroes, perfect marksmen, and romanticized gunfights simplify a world defined by complexity. Real heroism was quieter, a woman preserving food for winter, a family braving a blizzard, a child learning the rhythms of life through work and play. Violence existed, but it was interwoven with survival, governance, and cultural negotiation, rather than a constant series of duels or shootouts. Understanding the frontier requires separating legend from lived experience, recognizing courage in its most practical and unglamorous forms. Railroads and corporations reshaped the landscape, introducing both opportunity and constraint. Travel that once took months became days, local economies integrated with national markets. Large mining operations, cattle companies, and agricultural enterprises often displaced smallholders, yet they also contributed infrastructure, trade, and connectivity. Communities adapted to these changes unevenly, sometimes resisting, sometimes embracing them. The transition from frontier chaos to structured society illustrates the tension between freedom and order, innovation and regulation, a dynamic still relevant in contemporary life. The environment, vast and majestic, shaped human behavior and thought. Bison herds once numbered in the tens of millions, yet were decimated by hunting, policy, and expansion. Rivers, forests, and plains were exploited with little understanding of long-term consequences. Native agricultural systems, sophisticated and sustainable, were often ignored or destroyed. The frontier teaches the fragility of ecosystems, the consequences of human action, and the ethical dimensions of resource use. Respect for the land was not innate, it was learned through necessity and consequence. As the sun rises and sets in the frontier imagination, one notices cycles, seasons governing work, life, and community events. Harvest festivals, holidays, and religious observances offered respite, connection, and celebration amidst toil. They reinforced cultural norms and provided spaces for reflection, storytelling, and transmission of knowledge. Even amid the physical struggle, moments of joy, music, dance, and social interaction affirmed human resilience and the capacity to create meaning. In reflecting on the frontier, it becomes clear that survival was inseparable from adaptation, knowledge, and flexibility. Those who endured developed skills and sensibilities that modern life rarely requires: improvisation in the face of scarcity, empathy in the coordination of community labor, judgment in balancing risk and reward. Their accomplishments were often invisible, recorded in diaries, letters, and oral traditions rather than monuments or films. Yet their influence persists, shaping the social, legal, and environmental frameworks of the modern West. Frontier legacies extend beyond geography. Property laws, water rights, corporate governance, and community structures trace roots to these formative decades. Cultural diversity, sometimes enforced and sometimes voluntary, created networks of knowledge, adaptation, and resilience. Intergenerational trauma among native communities, alongside the achievements of immigrant laborers, reminds us that history is rarely simple or unidimensional. The frontier embodies both triumph and tragedy, courage and cruelty, abundance and scarcity, a mirror for the human condition. As night falls, you realize that the frontier is also a meditation on time itself. Days were measured in labor, not leisure, seasons dictated activity, survival demanded attention to cycles imperceptible in modern life. Yet this rhythm offered insight, connection, and perspective. Life was immediate, intense, and consequential. Modern readers and viewers romanticize this intensity in myths of adventure, but the lived experience was demanding and morally complex. There were no spectators, everyone had a role, and every decision carried weight. The final lesson lingers in your mind. Human resilience is not a product of innate heroism alone, but of adaptation, cooperation, and continual engagement with both environment and society. Ordinary people, through extraordinary circumstances, shaped landscapes, communities, and cultures. Their story is embedded in the land, in law, in social practice, and in the memory of those who study it. The frontier teaches that heroism can be quiet, persistent, and practical. It can be found in labor, in caregiving, in teaching, and in the relentless pursuit of survival against formidable odds. Even in sleep, the frontier remains present. You hear the distant howl of a coyote, feel the whisper of wind through tall prairie grasses, and sense the stars stretching infinitely overhead. These constellations, unchanged for centuries, connect past and present, observer and survivor. They remind you that the frontier is more than a historical period. It is a lens for understanding humanity. Courage, endurance, ingenuity, and empathy are not relics. They are enduring capacities, relevant in every age, illuminated most clearly by a society stripped to essentials. And so, as you lie in modern comfort, the stories of the frontier settle around you like a gentle weight. You are no longer a witness to gunfights, gold strikes, or stagecoach robberies, but to something far richer, the texture of real life, in its challenge, complexity, and beauty. You carry the endurance of those who toiled, the ingenuity of those who innovated, and the resilience of those who persevered. In these quiet lessons, the Wild West remains alive, not as legend, but as lived experience, teaching you the depth, complexity, and enduring relevance of human courage. Sleep now, carrying with you the sounds, the labor, the triumphs, and the quiet heroism of a world both distant and familiar. The frontier, harsh and magnificent, offers more than history, it offers perspective. It reminds you that survival is a balance of skill and luck, effort and cooperation, imagination and pragmatism. It teaches that human life, even in its most vulnerable form, holds richness, dignity, and meaning. And as you drift further into sleep, the echoes of the frontier whisper softly, connecting you across time to the ordinary people whose extraordinary lives built the foundation of the American West, and in turn, the nation itself.